¿De qué vamos a hablar en el primer panel? De lo que la tele habla poco. Algunos hacemos el esfuerzo, pero no necesariamente triunfamos siempre. Los casos de éxito, ¿los hay? Sí, los hay. Los tiene Argentina, los tiene el mundo. En general se aprende de los casos de éxito, no del fracaso. Más allá de que el fracaso a veces construye el mejor éxito, ¿no? Muy bien. Bueno, vamos a conocer experiencias de otros países, casos locales, vamos a pensar entre todos cómo podemos ir hacia esa Argentina que probablemente muchos soñemos. Todos comparten ciertamente un factor común. Son casos donde se implementaron políticas públicas para el desarrollo del agro que se mantienen a lo largo del tiempo. ¿Qué van a ver? ¿Qué les van a contar los panelistas? El rol del agro y las principales mejoras en los últimos 20 años, el impacto en la sociedad. ¿Qué otra cosa vamos a ver? Bueno, los acuerdos alcanzados, los principales obstáculos, los ejemplos de políticas públicas concretas, los desafíos mirando al mundo. De eso vamos a hablar. Ahí están las preguntas que ustedes están respondiendo en las distintas pantallas. ¿Terminaron? ¿Estamos? ¿Escuchamos el primer caso de éxito? ¿Les parece? Bueno, no está aquí con nosotros. Está un poco lejos. Pero muchas veces se habló de la analogía entre Australia y Argentina, Argentina y Australia, las similitudes, la geografía, los habitantes. Bueno, vamos a comenzar con Australia. Luego será el turno de Brasil. Y terminaríamos con Córdoba. Vamos a empezar por la experiencia a través de un video de Joanna Hewitt, ex secretaria de Agricultura. ¿De qué nos va a hablar? De esto.
It's a pleasure to join you at your important Congress, and I am very sorry not to be able to attend in person. Since the dawn of the last century, there's been a lot of shared experience between our agri-food sectors in Australia and Argentina. It's true that differences have emerged in our policy frameworks, but at times we've also shared approaches, especially during the years of early commercial agriculture and again in the 1980s and 90s. The sector is critical for both our countries, particularly for export income, and both countries contribute importantly to world food security, as well as confronting similar challenges from distorted global markets and volatile and more extreme climate trends. My aim is now to take you through the evolution of our agriculture sector and the dramatic reshaping in our policies over the last 5 decades. Australian agriculture's early success was built on the production and export of grains, meat, dairy, wool, and some horticultural products through to the middle of the 20th century, mainly to the United Kingdom under preferential trade arrangements. Our producer organisations at the state level, rather than nationally, worked closely with governments. Pervasive regulatory systems were built up over time. Marketing boards determined prices and production volumes, and governments provided credit and import subsidies to try to support farm incomes. Restrictions were imposed on some agricultural imports, but at lower rates than the tariff levels of our manufactured sector. They were intended to protect domestically focused industry and workers' incomes. Not much support was needed for agriculture in the world price boom years of the early 1950s. Nearly 80% of Australia's exports were agricultural, and what followed will be familiar to you. Progressive decline in world commodity prices and a narrowing of market opportunity with the establishment of the European Common Agricultural Policy. Further setbacks came for Australia when the UK joined the EEC without offering any access for Australian goods, and the global oil price shock added to the turmoil. A weakening Australian economy stimulated interest in a more open, competitive approach to economic management. High import costs for machinery and equipment were a drag on businesses. Transport and communications were costly, and conversations about opening up more to the world and encouraging innovation began to get traction from academics, but also in the media and in parts of the national bureaucracy. In 1973, the federal government made a surprise 25% cut in all import tariffs. The Tariff Board became the Industry's Assistance Commission and later became the Productivity Commission. It produced expert reviews, industry by industry, into the whole impact across the economy of the trade protection system. It held open public consultations and identified the cost of protection in dollar terms to consumers, businesses, and the wider national economy. Actually, little changed for the next decade, but the public mood shifted with a growing realization that unless changes were made, we would all be poorer. Another key development was the establishment in 1979 of a national-level farmers' organisation, the National Farmers' Federation, which continues today as the main voice of the farm sector. The NFF embraced a free trade agenda and called for deregulation to free up farmers' decision-making and foster innovation. It argued that policy interventions in agriculture were causing resources to be misallocated by distorting market price signals. The NFF also wanted manufacturing tariffs phased out to reduce farmers' costs. This new mood ushered in sweeping changes over the next 2 decades and covered periods in government of both major political parties. Floating of our dollar and removing exchange controls was a major step in 1983, and then came reshaping of trade policy, which brought tariffs progressively down to 5% or less, along with deregulation across the economy, including in agriculture. Support for these changes in both major political parties, centre-left and centre-right, was a powerful force for change. In agriculture, domestic market regulation and subsidies were largely phased out, and farmers were free to grow and sell their products, managing their operations without any constraints. Most reforms were made without compensation to farmers, but there were extensive consultations and advance warning of changes. Dairy sector reforms took longer than most, and after extended dialogue with the industry, payments were actually made to producers during the phased regulation of the fresh milk market. Farmers managed to adjust to the freer environment, but non-viable producers were offered assistance to exit from the industry. Among the last deregulatory reforms were the dismantling of the wool reserve price scheme and the single desk export power for wheat. Today, the only remaining controls are industry-managed marketing in rice and in sugar. By the late 1990s, there was a broad consensus that deregulated markets open to the world provided better prospects for producers than the systems of the past. Farmers were helped in their new situation by cost savings thanks to a new national competition policy that improved the efficiency of transport, energy, telecoms, and this included government monopoly providers. Other reforms in taxation and labour market flexibility also boosted competitiveness. Australia's index of trade intensity moved up from 27% in the mid-1980s to 44% 20 years later. Australia became active in global trade reform through the WTO, in agriculture, also working in coalition with partners like Argentina and the Cairns Group. We now have FTAs, free trade area agreements, with 16 countries covering most of our major markets, the US, China, Japan, Korea and New Zealand, for example, as well as Southeast Asian countries, and in your region, Chile and Peru. New free trade agreements are in late stage of negotiation with India and the EU. We now also participate in regional free trade groups like CPTPP, RCEP, and PESA with the Pacific Island countries. These agreements have expanded our access for agriculture products and helped us maintain markets as new producing countries negotiate agreements with our trading partners. Even so, we, like Argentina, suffer price disadvantages in world markets caused by the large distorting agricultural subsidies in Europe, Japan, and the US, and now also in more emerging economies like China, Korea, and Indonesia. For that reason, we continue to work together for a restart of the stalled agricultural negotiations in the WTO. Beyond trade and regulatory reforms, from the 1990s, new agricultural policy concerns attracted attention. The sustainability and security of access to water for all users, including both agriculture and the environment, has been prominent. Reforms were made in the water allocation system. Trading in water was established. This encouraged infrastructure improvements and innovation in water conservation. Pricing of water led to it being used for higher value products. It also helped farmers in dry times, allowing them to sell water when they produced less. More work is still needed to fully restore the health of our river systems, but a lot has been achieved. Australian agriculture has been growing, with gross value of production increasing almost 60% in real terms over the last 20 years. The sector contributes about 12% of national exports, and about 72% of our agricultural production is exported. It represents 2.4% of our gross domestic product and about the same share in employment. Cropping and livestock are the largest sectors, with gross value of production of about 38% each. Horticulture has 17%, and fisheries and forestry each between 3 and 4%. In the last 3 years, Australian agriculture has had favourable rainfall and world market prices, resulting in a record gross value of production of 90 billion Australian dollars. Farm cash income is also at record highs, especially for cropping. Even so, our producers are already preparing for more difficult times. In an open agricultural sector, adaptation is constant. Not all farm enterprises have survived. There are fewer, and the average size is larger. It's a more agile industry than most, with farmers themselves managing through shifts in world prices and volatile seasonal conditions. Off-farm income for farmers has played a part, for example, in farm tourism or with household members in paid employment. Australia has one of the least supported farm sectors in the world, and public support concentrates on assistance with natural disasters, extreme seasonal conditions, on research, development and extension services, and adjustment assistance to farmers who want to leave the sector. Governments also fund public interest programs, for example, in infrastructure and environmental improvement. Priorities there include water, soils, biosecurity management, and biodiversity programs, climate change, of course, management and preparedness. Australian farmers have become impressive risk managers by necessity. For example, by investing in on-farm water and grains storage, pioneering tillage cropping practices to optimise water and pesticide or fertiliser use, switching production between commodities according to market trends, recently from livestock into cropping, has also been important. All this has generated productivity advances to maintain competitiveness and farm incomes through periods of poor weather and adverse prices. The benefits of a more flexible, open economy have been demonstrated through two major economic shocks this century. Australia was one of the very few countries to survive the global financial crisis without interruption to its long period of growth. This was partly due to favourable conditions, especially for our minerals and energy sectors, but the adaptation capacity of our reformed economy was important. We also survived better than most economies through the pandemic, with only 1 quarter year of yet negative growth. Unprecedented social spending during the COVID pandemic supported health responses and payments for employment and business continuity. So restoring public finances will take some years, but again, our economy's resilience has been impressive. Looking ahead, I see critical challenges from further shocks to the projected climate change and from transition to decarbonise our economy. From geopolitical tensions that have the capacity to disrupt global market challenges, from rising costs from global inflation and lower growth, including in some important emerging economy markets, and also finally from supply chain and capability risks and gaps underlining the importance of R&D. I appreciate that some of Australia's reform history does not entirely align with the issues you confront. As I see the policy landscape for Argentina's agriculture, a critical handicap is the cost disadvantage and the market uncertainty imposed by export taxes on some products since the early 2000s. They inevitably reduce the production volume and investment. Domestic market price controls are much less effective than targeted support for food insecure groups, and they also disadvantage Argentina's producers, who receive 16% less than world market prices, according to the OECD. I do understand the motivation for these measures, but the cost burden is a heavy one. They are a disincentive to innovation, and they undermine GDP and growth prospects for the nation. If they were removed, however, alternative tax revenue sources would be needed. During Australia's reform process, a major rebalancing in taxation involved the introduction of capital gains tax and a general sales tax that generated additional revenue. This meant that personal and company taxes could be reduced to improve our competitiveness while protecting growing social spending. With the right policy mix and careful phasing, the whole population can benefit. Our experience suggests that bringing high-quality, respected analysis of these issues into the public domain can shift opinion among farmers, consumers, and policymakers. I encourage your organisation to initiate and contribute to these debates. This is a medium-term task. It would involve changes in policy well beyond the agriculture sector alone. We face difficult global, economic, and geopolitical conditions. But hard times can sometimes be the stimulus that's needed for change. This was true for Australia in the early 1980s. The evidence of decades shows that it was worth the effort. Experience also tells us the job is never done, and there will always be more we need to do. I wish you well for your deliberations, and thank you for the opportunity to join your conference.